And good afternoon, everyone. I am really excited to be here with y'all to talk about communicating science in a post-truth world and how to craft messages that resonate. I'm also honored to be sharing this stage with Dr. Bergman, Dr. Head, and Mr. Robinson this week. I also have to say that I had a really interesting conversation and also enjoyed hearing the dialogue within the Science and Risk Communication group earlier today, and I had to really hold myself back from revamping my talk in the last 2 hours. But for those of you who are really interested in science communication, that's definitely an interest group to check out. So as Cam said, my technical background is in wetland ecology, though having worked at Environmental Defense Fund, particularly during the time of TSCA reform passage, and having several friends in the field, I have a really great appreciation for the work that you do. So I've worked and studied in the broader realm of science communication and science policy for over a decade, and from different angles in academia, studying science policy, as a practitioner of science communication in the NGO world, and now I work on the training side of things. So before we dive in, I just would like to tell you a little bit about Compass. Compass is a boundary organization, which means that we work at the interface of science and policy. Our organization was founded on the premise that science needs to have a seat at this decision-making table because science and scientists themselves have the potential to transform critical dialogues. And a key part of science playing this instrumental role in decision-making is effective science communication. And that's what we do, right? We help scientists become effective communicators. And we forge connections between scientists and other audiences by giving scientists the context, networks, and relationships they need to be empowered to bring their science into the conversation. So this is all in the name of policy, resource management, and the broader public discourse being better informed by science. So let's talk about this post-truth world for a minute. The term post-truth is now a mainstay in political discourse, as I'm sure many of you know, where objective facts and evidence can be lost in the noise that's generated to direct appeals through emotion and to deeply held beliefs. So this term really became widespread, of course, during the 2016 presidential election here in the US, and also with the Brexit referendum in the UK regarding their membership in the European Union. And the Oxford Dictionaries actually declared post-truth the international word of the year in 2016, citing a 2,000% increase in usage compared to 2015. And then there's also this, which more often than not is the context in which scientists are communicating. It says, I don't know why I don't care about the bottom of the ocean, but I don't. So when people don't care about something that you think is really important and interesting, or something that you actually think is essential to their well-being in your field, right? That can be super frustrating. Environmental toxicology and chemistry has also gotten a lot of public and policy attention over the last few years, as I'm sure you know, from the ongoing lead and water crisis in Flint to bright spots like the passage of TSCA reform through the Lautenberg Act in 2016. But it's not just human health that we need to be concerned with, right? Being a native of Louisiana, I have a special appreciation for how pesticides and pharmaceuticals that we introduce into the environment can affect wildlife and organisms at all parts of the food web. And it can take years, sometimes decades, sometimes multiple generations for the effects of exposure to different chemicals and substances to be detected. So with that in mind, and in this post-truth world where people may or may not care, how do you even begin trying to effectively communicate your science? Finding common ground. This is something that I will return to throughout the talk. Effective communication is ultimately about finding points of intersection and connection between what it is that you care about and want to communicate and the cares, values, and beliefs of your audience. And in case you can't read this comic, which I can hardly read on my screen, it says, raise the old girl from a cub. I did. Of course, we had to get a few things straight between us. She don't try to follow me into town anymore, and I don't try to take her food bowl away until she's done. So even though it may feel like communicating science in this post-truth world is harder than it's ever been, it is a noble and worthy cause to take on. And I congratulate all of you for being willing to take on that challenge. And in the words of New York Times science journalist Carl Zimmer, democracy, science, and journalism are three valuable institutions that have made life in this country far better than it would be without them. They are worth defending and worth keeping free of corruption. So, having decided to take on the mantle of science communication, and in honor of Election Day, let's do a few polls. So to get a sense of how this group feels about a few different facets of communication, please raise your hand if you agree with any of the following statements. There is tension between what the science indicates and what your audience wants to hear. Yes, it's working. Communicating with public audiences is one of the most challenging things you do. Communicating with your non-scientist peers is one of the most challenging things you do. Okay. You have a hard time figuring out what is the most important thing to convey about your science. Okay. So you are not alone, right? Not only are there clearly shared challenges in this room, but Compass works with scientists across the country who face similar challenges. And while we don't have time to do a really deep dive into tools and skill development today, I'm going to share some fundamental principles of effective science communication that hopefully can help you start that journey to bridging the gap between your expertise and the audiences that you want to share your science with. So, science communication is a lot like drawing. On the surface, it seems simple, until you actually try to draw the owl. So, as we just saw, there are a lot of challenges and frustrations in communicating your science. And one way we often deal with this is to simply blast people with more information, right? The fire hose effect. Lots of scientists employ this strategy. You've likely experienced it personally and have probably been guilty of doing it yourself. I definitely have. It's really easy to do, and it is a hard habit to break. The issue is that when we're asked to communicate something complex, we often want to start at the very beginning and explain every little thing that we know until you get to the main point, right? But being on the receiving end of that fire hose can be really frustrating, and honestly, it's super boring, right? Think grad school, yeah. A lot of people also employ this strategy. Sometimes we are like tourists. We think if we just speak loudly enough, people will understand. But it's not a matter of speaking loudly or even more clearly. The issue is that giving people more information is not the answer. There's often this mentality, oh, I should have checked this before. Okay, I'll try to do, you can't see that, sorry. There's often this mentality of, if only you knew what I knew, then you would believe what I believe, right? That's wrong. In the science of science communication, this is what we call the deficit model. And there's lots of evidence and research showing that this does not work. yet it drives a lot of our behavior and a lot of scientific outreach. But people are not empty vessels just waiting to be filled. Scientists dumping more data on society is not going to solve the problem. That information is not enough is one of the most foundational concepts in the science of science communication literature. Despite that, a lot of science communication is still plagued by the assumptions of the deficit model. Instead, we need to shift to a model centered around dialogue and figure out how to engage people in conversation, where listening to the perspectives and needs of others is just as important as being clear about what you bring to the table. So, let's talk about one reason why dialogue is so important. In this photo, what do you see? Raise your hand if you think this photo shows an offensive foul. All right, we've got a few hands. A defensive foul? No foul. I'm gonna get the most for this last one. Raise your hand if you just see basketball and you have no idea what's going on. Right? Yes, okay. So, in theory, what that exercise demonstrates is that what is happening in this image is up for interpretation. So what you see here depends on who you're rooting for. We see what supports our values. We see what we want to see, and we hear what we want to hear. And there's a lot of psychological research to back this up. In particular, a famous psychology experiment where researchers showed students from 2 Ivy League colleges a football game between their schools in which officials made a series of controversial calls. Students who attended the offending institution saw half as many illegal plays as the students from the opposing institution did. So now that we know that what we see is informed by our values, the next question is then, why is there such polarization? There are really 2 key factors that social scientists have identified to begin answering that question. One of that is cultural cognition. And cultural cognition looks at how cultural values shape our perceptions. This is a growing area of social science research, and it's demonstrating that people react to scientific evidence in much the same way as they decide who was fouling whom. We, and I say we very deliberately to make it clear that those of us in this room are not immune to this, we take positions that reinforce our cultural identity. And we accept or reject information based on that cultural identity and its associated values. Humans are social animals, right? And at a fundamental level, our survival depends on maintaining social ties. So going against these ties is extremely difficult. The second factor that feeds into a lot of polarization is called motivated reasoning. The phenomena occurs when people form and cling to false beliefs despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary because they seek out information that confirms what they already believe. Dan Kahan is a professor of law and psychology at Yale, and he's shown that scientific literacy actually isn't a predictor of whether people believe in hot-button issues such as climate change or gun control. Groups with opposing values often become more polarized, not less, when exposed to science, because they actively resist information that could threaten the defining values of their group. We all know that one person, at least, we're probably related to them, who is well-educated, a seemingly reasonable person, but has really far-out beliefs on some controversial issues. And this, as well, is a really foundational piece in the science of science communication. So here's another way that context matters. What do you see here? I hear lots of mumbling. Somebody want to tell me what they see? A B. A B or a 13. Either way, right? So this is called the broken bee experiment. And as you just experienced, when the context around this image changed, you saw different things. People interpret things based on their own context, as well as the surrounding context. And I suspect you can think of all sorts of different social, religious, economic, cultural contexts in which you might be communicating your science, right? The point is that they mean something and they affect how what you share is received. And so, got both of those there. This is a picture I took right before coming in here as I was walking around meditating before my speech, as people do. What do y'all see here? Heart, heart, heart? Hear the art, exactly, right? So that's right outside our door. So the takeaway here is that when it comes to thinking about communicating science, context and values matter, right? The way that people process information is strongly tied to their values and cultural identities. And understanding the lens through which your audience is looking, what they care about, and what they value can help you figure out how to connect with them effectively. So we've talked about models of communication, shifting from a deficit model to one of engagement. We've talked about how part of this new model of engagement is dialogue, which requires meeting people where they're at and understanding that their values, as do yours, shape each of your perceptions of the world. And that taking context into account is essential to communicate with, not just to your audience effectively. And another principle of effective science communication is that it requires both respect and trust. And so when faced with making a decision about something, the research shows that we rely on social cues from people who we trust. So what is trust based on? Susan Fiske is a professor of psychology at Princeton, and she's found that it's not the lack of respect that scientists are lacking. Excuse me. We're not lacking a lack of respect. It's trust that we're lacking. And trustworthiness is a combination of perceived warmth and competence. Scientists are seen as competent but cold. And there's a growing body of research to support this. So if scientists have a warmth problem, and thus a trust problem, what do we do to overcome that fact that we are lacking this crucial dimension to effective communication? Well, in their 2016 paper, researchers Anthony Dudo and John Beasley summarized that positive beliefs about science and scientists are more likely to stem from high-quality interactions with likable and engaging scientists who are willing to listen. So there are some really great nuggets in here. High-quality interactions. That means that you, the communicator, care not only about your work, but about the interaction itself, about that moment of connection between you and your audience. Likable and engaging. And the word likable can really put people off here, but it's just another way to think about warmth, right? A critical dimension of warmth is being yourself, right? The idea of warmth isn't to become something you're not. It's not to be sickly sweet with everyone you meet or that adorable teddy bear of a person that everybody loves, right? If that's not you, right? This is about being authentic. And lastly, listen. And this goes right to the heart of the engagement model, making your science communication about dialogue. So part of being authentic, of letting who you are shine through, is to speak from your why. This is a great way to foster connections with people. Simon Sinek has written books and given TED Talks on motivation and leadership in the business world. And he says, communicate from your why. It's the why that motivates people to care and builds trust. So think about it. If you only have 5 minutes of someone's time, they are more likely to listen and to remember your why than your what, right? why your work matters is more likely to resonate with your audience. And sharing your why builds trust because it helps your audience understand you a little bit more, right? And this can be super challenging for scientists because we are trained so rigorously to keep ourselves as much as possible out of our science, right? But it's essential to put yourself back in the story of your science if you want audiences to connect with your work. Another way to think about why is to ask, so what, right? The so what is why anyone would pay any attention to what you're saying. And in order to craft a meaningful so what, you must know who your audience is, why you want to communicate with them, and what they care about. The key here is to figure out who is your audience. The more specific your audience is, the easier it's going to be to figure out how to tailor your message. And so here are some examples of the audiences that you might be wanting to try to reach. All of these people have different concerns, values, perspectives. For example, a policymaker might be wondering whether this information impacts their constituents. A journalist might be wondering if this makes a good story. So the more explicitly you define your audience, the easier it will be to figure out your message and why it matters to them. We commonly hear from scientists that they want to reach the general public. The challenge with trying to reach the general public, like really reach them, not just put something out on Twitter, not that there's not a place for that, but is that there's an awful lot of heterogeneity within that broad group. So the general public is made up of a super diverse group of people with really different needs and priorities. So when you're thinking about your audience, it's really helpful to be more specific. Being specific helps you make your messages as relevant as possible to what your audience values and cares about. This is what we call the so what prism. So when light enters a prism, what happens? Yeah, it's diffracted, and it comes out at different angles. So think of your message as pure white light entering the prism and being filtered and diffracted by what matters to your audience. So if you know your audience and you understand their so what, you can modify your message to focus on what matters to that specific audience the most, right? For example, within agencies, what will it cost in terms of time, effort, money, right? And will it work? I'm sure that a lot of you know exactly what this is about. In terms of educators, right? Will this capture my students' attention if you're trying to reach younger audiences via their teachers? Things like that. So there might be a dozen different potential audiences for your science, but in order to figure out who your audience should be, you really first need to think about you. What are your goals? How do you want to be an agent of change? So before you communicate with a particular audience, think about what it is that you actually want to accomplish, right? Who are you communicating with and why are really important questions to ask and answer before you get your science out there. Based on who you are, what you're comfortable doing, right? And what you're passionate about. Where are you best suited to engage? You can do anything, but you can't do everything, and so you need to be strategic. So in that 2016 Dudo and Beasley study that I referenced earlier, they found that scientists most prioritize communication designed to defend science from misinformation and educate the public about science, and least prioritize communication that seeks to build trust and establish resonance with the public. So the science of science communication literature is telling us that strategic science communication would involve scientists engaging more and promoting dialogue. But scientists continue to prioritize more traditional objectives like defensive science. And that's not to say that defensive science doesn't have a place, particularly in this day and age, right? But if you're preparing for a defense, you're likely not listening to respond. You're likely listening to respond instead of listening to understand. And when engaging into a conversation, it's really important to show the other person that you want to understand them, right? And where they're coming from. So one underlying reason for the challenges around actually doing this is that we're often communicating across difference, as we've talked about. Differences of perspective, values, experiences. And humans are wired to interact in agree-disagree mode, to see things as black and white. So when we begin an interaction by listening to respond, we get caught in the cycle of disagree, defend, destroy, right? I'm sure you can all picture this. You've probably experienced it. I experience it regularly with my partner, right? But this is all about being right? Or defeating or convincing the other person. You're not there to listen and understand them. So instead of gearing up for battle, think about how you can enter conversations in a way that is more about alignment, finding those points of connection. And then remember that this takes practice, right? You will likely have to adjust your approach along the way because you're going to be learning about yourself as a communicator and about your audience, just as you learned to be a scientist over many years. Because at the heart of effective communication is finding intersections between what you care about and what your audience cares about. As a personal example, in my previous work in coastal restoration in Louisiana, I often talked about my deep family roots and personal connection to Louisiana wetlands to convey to stakeholders that we loved the same place, we're from the same place, and actually had the same goal in mind for our homeland, even if ultimately we had very different backgrounds. And you don't necessarily have to get that personal, but it's these points of connection, these shared goals between you and your audience where a relationship built on trust begins to form. And this can help catalyze your communication from one-way dialogue to true engagement. So we've talked a lot about your audience as you as a communicator and your interactions, right? But we haven't actually talked about the important stuff, your science. And if you can't read in the back, it says, oh, if it were only so simple. So here's the big problem with talking about your science. You know too much. You know just about more about your subject than anyone else, and especially more than non-scientists. And your tendency, as we talked about with the fire hose effect, is to want to share it all. And it can really feel daunting and sometimes impossible to pull out a clear, self-contained message that anyone could understand from everything that you've got stored up in your brain. But remember, you didn't learn all this overnight. And so it's not really feasible to think that you could share more than a fraction of what you know with someone during a short conversation. So instead of fire hosing people, think about how you can distill your messages down into something that's a little bit easier to swallow. So let's say I were to put this tray of things in front of you for a moment. And then take it away. Now take a moment and write down 3 things that you remember from that tray. Write it down. Need a list. How many you had all three things the same? How many of you had two things the same? Okay. How many of you had one thing the same? Okay. But if I showed you a tray that looked like this, everyone, in theory, would be able to remember the same three items, right? Cognitive research tells us that our brains can only hold 3 to 5 pieces of information in our short-term memory at any one time. So you want to limit the number of ideas that you share. If you want people to remember what you've actually said, you have the opportunity to pick your top 3 pieces of information and focus on those. Because otherwise, they will remember what they want to. Word choice also really matters. Jargon is a great way to turn people off. It can be a beautiful thing if you're with an audience of your peers. It lets you say exactly what you mean. But in reality, it's a specialized language. And it doesn't work at all for those outside the circle. And it can lose much of its meaning, and in fact, it might mean something really different to non-scientists. And sometimes it can be tricky to identify jargon because we're so used to it and steeped in our own worlds, and we don't even notice when we're doing it. Or terms that we might think are really clear are not. We call this sneaky jargon. And for me, I always thought that it was pretty easy to figure out what adaptive management was, right? That's what I used to do. I mean, everyone knows the word management, and except maybe toddlers, right? You know what it is to be adaptive, so, right, why don't you know what that means? But in reality, it is a technical and nuanced term, and it often leaves audiences feeling like they don't understand what you're talking about, and it can really alienate them. So we are gonna play a very truncated game of Jargon Alert, given the time. So, who wants to tell me, someone in the front row? Hot seats. That's aerosol in a layperson's term. A spray can, right? Yes. That's probably what it means to a non-scientist, but also a tiny atmospheric particle, right? And there can be different definitions, right? Exposure. How many times a day do you write exposure? Do you mean the same thing every time that you write it? All right? A definition could be how a chemical can get into your body. Aggregate exposure. I had a friend help me with these. I was like, that aggregate does not mean that to me at all, right? Microbiota. Yeah, small living things. Yeah, right? No, low on oxygen or no oxygen. This is a pretty easy one. Food web, right? So the point is that some of these words that we use really readily are jargon. And there are sometimes really simple ways and sometimes not ways of breaking it down. So acronyms, just like jargon, you should avoid them, right? The acronym soup is super common when working with government agencies and even within academia, right? But just like jargon, chances are it's a foreign language to at least someone in your audience. So don't assume that everyone in the room knows what you're referring to when you use an acronym. One thing that most other audiences have in common is that they want to know the bottom line up front. As scientists, we spend so much time on background and supporting materials and how it ties into the broader body of knowledge, yada, yada, yada. But whether you're talking to policymakers or journalists or a group of concerned parents, we need to flip how we communicate our science on its head. Most other people are less concerned about how you got to your results than with what those results are and how they affect them personally. We need to talk in clear, concise terms about what we know, why it matters, and then be ready to back it up. How we present information is also really important. As scientists, we learned to communicate like this. But to reach a broader audience, we need to structure things differently. And even though we publish papers like this in this format, we typically neither write them nor read them in that order, right? So at Compass, we have developed a deceptively simple tool called the message box. And the intent of this tool is to help you sort through that mound of information you have in your head and to distill that complexity down to the essence of what it is that you want to convey about your science to a specific audience. So some of you hopefully got a printout of the message box worksheet, and you can refer along to that now and hopefully use it later. There are also lots of other materials on our website and our blog, including the fantastic message box workbook, which is readily available to anyone, and also feel free to share it. The workbook shares a lot of insights that we've gathered over the years from teaching the message box to literally thousands of scientists. And it's a really rich resource because it's coming out of nearly 20 years' experience in the field. So I'm going to kind of briefly walk you through these different sections to give you a sense of the tool. And just remember that this is a sorting tool, right, to help you organize all the information in your head and then distill it down into meaningful pieces for your particular audience. So the first thing you want to do is identify your audience. We've already covered this excessively. But it's really important that you start with this because each of the following sections is going to be dependent on who that audience is. And so after you define your audience, you can really address the rest of the sections in any order that works for you. And don't get too hung up on what goes in what box. This is an iterative process. I typically like to start with the issue. Really can't see my pointer. But the issue is the overarching topic at a big, broad scale. And this is the 30,000-foot view on a topic. And related to that is the problem. So this is your slice of the issue. This could be your research question or perhaps your findings. One way that I think of in terms of distinguishing issue and problems is the issue is more like the search terms that you might use in terms of researching rather than your actual question. And then you have the solutions. What can you do about this problem? What are you doing? Or maybe, what can you ask your audience to do? And then you have the benefits. This is why anyone would care. Why does your audience why are they interested in this? So I'm sure that you've seen this comic, but if we were message boxing this problem and the solution was to keep global temperatures from rising 1.5 degrees Celsius, these over here on the presentation, those would be the benefits. So a lot of times I'll think about the benefits here as the co-benefits. And then your so what? Again, we've covered this, right? This is really what it is that's going to hook your audience. So you don't have to have super different things in all of your different sections. There's likely going to be overlap. Remember that this is an iterative process. You're going to move stuff into different sections. You're going to scrap stuff you originally thought was essential. And honestly, you'd be surprised at how frequently, particularly if you're working on a grant proposal, that your issue or problem changes as you start to think about what the other elements are. The other thing is that you don't actually talk to your audience like this. You don't necessarily have to walk through each section. There's a difference between messages and the message box. And so I just want to quickly walk through an example of a message box from a scientist who's taken a Compass training. So this is Dr. Jonathan Patz, who works in population health sciences at the University of Wisconsin. And in 2005, he submitted a review paper to Nature on climate change and human health, and soon after he attended a message box workshop as part of a leadership program. His identified audience was national journalists, and the first draft of his message box looked like this. So I think we can agree there's a lot going on here. And the point here is absolutely not to make fun of Dr. Patz. But this just feels so impenetrable. But it's also pretty typical of what we see from scientists in their first drafts. And I love the fact that he actually explicitly called out caveats. This is the classic case of too much information. And apparently this is also how he talked about his research as well, just an avalanche of information. And this may be great in some regards, but it's hard to imagine hooking an audience of national journalists with this much detail and nuance. But with some work and refinement, Dr. Patz narrowed his message box down to this. So he not only developed clear, simple messages, but suddenly he saw that his most powerful so what was not originally the focus of his paper. Thinking through his research in a different way helped him uncover an ethical message in his work, that those most at risk from climate change-related disease were not the ones causing the problem. Right, and this is a great example, not only because of the stark contrast in terms of before and after, but because it shows that the message box can do more than just help you boil down what you're trying to say, right? It can actually help change the way you view the implications of your science. And it can illuminate points that were just there under the surface. So I already noted that there's a distinction between the message box and messages. The message box is a tool to help you get to your messages, but what you actually say might not be what's written down there. First, you get your message box nailed down, and then you start figuring out your messages, how you actually phrase things. Think of this as cracking the door open, right? You want to get people interested in what you have to say so that they will want to know more, right? They'll ask you questions, rather than you overwhelming them and them running away, or their eyes glazing over, or playing Candy Crush or something. So your messages should be your take-home ideas. Simple, but not simplistic, right? You want to simplify, but don't dumb down. Your audience isn't dumb. They just don't have as much background in the topic as you do. But you'll also want to have numbers and data ready, right? These details that help make the concepts that you've introduced to them more concrete. Lastly, this. The science is the same, but the audience and the use of the science may be different. You have to think, who is your audience and what is the action you want them to take with your science? Whether you have 30 seconds or 3 days, your message box shouldn't change. Your message box should be the core of what you want to communicate about your science to a particular audience. However, if your audience changes, if you decide on a new target, you need to revisit your message box to make sure that what you've distilled down is still relevant to your new audience. So I want to leave you with 3 keys to science communication. Words used by the late Stephen Schneider, a Stanford scientist who devoted much of his energy to becoming a more effective communicator. Know thy audience. Who are they? Where are they coming from? What matters to them? Know thyself. How can you most effectively share your work? How can you be your authentic self and let that shine through? What is it that works for you? Know thy stuff. Be confident in what you know. Be honest and be clear. And always Begin with the end in mind. Have a goal. And just a little reminder as you embark on new science communication challenges, that everyone secretly is human. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I have really appreciated the time, and I will be at the poster social because there's no time for questions. Come talk to me there.